relation to other groups of people. You need at least two all the time, and usually going to have multiple. Process of identifying groups of people in relation to other groups based upon notions of phenotype and ancestry, at the very least. The process of assigning meaning to those identities vis-a-vis the meaning of other identities, right? Always at least two groups. And the process of prescribing and or instituting consequences for those identities that are going to differ in some way from another group, okay? And race-making institutions are all around us. They are in our schools, they are in our legal system, they are in our prisons, and one of the older pictures, slavery, a huge race-making institution, right? This is where we do this work. We are doing it right now, right? We make race through our conversations by sharing the ideologies that are in our head about identifying people and the meanings about them that we make in ourselves. So we do this work, you know, mundanely, right? The identification, the meaning assignment, the prescription of consequences can be done by ourselves. So this is a picture that I took in Humboldt Park in Chicago. I lived in Chicago for 5 years, and Puerto Rican Day Parade. And this guy was like repping hard. This is who I am Boricua, right? He's saying it loud and proud. That's self-identification. This is the ascription of race onto others, right? The meaning making. This idea, right, when Barack Obama runs for president the first time around, right? These are the ideas of who he is and who Michelle Obama is. This idea of terrorist, militant, untrustworthy, right? That is the projection. And so we're always doing this type of work, right? And so with that, we can use, so like in the case of, you know, this man in the Puerto Rican Day Parade, right? He's claiming, right? There's a power in that. And in many ways, that power is claimed because it's necessary, right? It's a pushback against white supremacy. It's a pushback against colonialism. So race, even though some people feel like, God, if we could just get rid of it, everything would be so much better, right? Race can be also used in anti-racist ways, right? The naming of it, the talking about it, the identifying with it can be used to push back. Racism, right, is a feature of our society where there's patterns of public policy and institutions, and you start to see these things over and over again. Dominant ideologies, one of them being colorblindness, right? Popular representation serve to perpetuate social, political, economic inequities between racial groups, especially in relation to what is going on with anti-Blackness, right? There's an array of anti-Black practices that perpetuate white privilege. So race and racism, not exactly, obviously related, not the same thing, right? See, how much more time do I have on this section before break? I'm losing time. 7:25. Like 8 minutes or so?
Yeah, actually 9 minutes, yeah.
Okay. So it seems like I've kind of talked a lot about some structure, politics, and I'll bring it back to a minute for the kind of interpersonal, the cognitive, the psychological, the ideological, that we all have implicit biases or implicit attitudes because our brain is always making these shortcuts, especially in a jiffy, right? Meaning making about the people around us and the places that we go. But we don't even have to go places to get these messages, right? For decades, people in the United States, and as well as elsewhere, have been watching the television, right? They've been going to the movies and they've been seeing images over and over and over again. And so when you live in a super segregated society like we do, residentially speaking, that it's through media often where we are we are becoming acquainted with one another in some way, right? In some really myopic way. And these images over and over and over again are shaping what's going, the decisions that we make. And it's happening to all of us, right? And it's not just about race. There's all kinds of things we do with gender. There's all kinds of things we do with sexual orientation. There's all kinds of things we do with class and ability. We're doing it all the time. Now, that doesn't seem to square up very well with all these ideas we have about equality and, the content of people's character, because you don't know the content of these people's character once when you're encountering somebody for the first time, you don't know anything about them. If you have vision with your eyes and you see them, that's what you're encountering. Or if you're blind but you can still hear, right? There are blind people can be racist too, right? The meaning making, there's a whole beautiful scholarship I could direct you to if you want to read about that. So when it comes to the work that y'all are doing, it's important for us to recognize these things, that everyone's doing this. It's creating a lot of inequality. I think some of you probably took me up on the invitation to do the implicit bias test, right? And you ever want to have questions about that, we can talk about in Q&A. But sometimes the road is smoother between, seeing a kind of person and the ideas we have about them, the more frequently we encounter that stereotype. So this is not a training in implicit biases, but one of the things that we can do, one, is recognize that we're doing it. Okay, so we take a look at that. And what I've read recently is, that countering or encountering different types of messages or varieties of type of messages about different types of people, like creating variety, is going to complicate those implicit biases. It's going to make it a little bit more messy, so that that smooth road between, seeing, a certain type of person and making assumption about them gets a little bit more muddled, right? Like there's work that we can do to make that more difficult for our brains, right? To challenge ourselves to not make those assumptions. For decades, people have also suggested that, the more contact that we have with different types of people, but on equal footing, right, that our peers, matters a good deal. But that's not to say this all goes away. I don't believe that does that. I don't think anybody's making that claim. That we can have, that I can be a woman and have implicit biases about women, right? That I can hold these ideas that work against myself. That also happens. So there's a lot of work to be done on this. And so what it means for restorative justice, the questions I would pose to you are, when it comes to people who are making decisions about who is eligible to participate in an RJ program, right? This idea of referrals seems to be up to the discretion, depending on what kind of program you're in. And I know that in Fairfax County, what I've learned is that it is up to police officers it's at their discretion to make the referrals, to then see if the if this person who's being appointed is eligible. But first it has to go through the officer. And so, with implicit biases in mind, is that the best thing to do? Are there other ways of administrating this? Are there ways to hold people accountable, to keep challenging people, to make sure that they're not making these cognitive, unconscious decisions on their own about who's a good candidate for RJ and who's not? I think that matters a lot. And I don't have the answer. But that's one of the ways that implicit bias can, really not bring the best out of a process like restorative justice, because it's going to continue to create disparities, and there are people who could have really benefited from it who are not going to be able to. And I'm going to link that later after break to what that means for when we're writing policy, particularly talking about like race neutral language, and then you still get a production of disparate impact. So I think I'm right at, I'm looking at.
You are, yeah.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
So I guess, should we break and then we'll come back and we'll talk about race neutral language?
Sure, let's do that.
Are being made right now. They're being reified right now. There are even maybe new racial categories that will emerge. And how is that different than ethnicity is like, always kind of bear in mind that we're talking about power, we're talking about consequences, we're talking about the meaning of racial categories always happening in conversation with other identities, other racial identities, right? It doesn't make any sense to just talk about whiteness in a vacuum, right? Whiteness makes sense in relation to all these other racial categories. It doesn't make sense to talk about blackness in a vacuum without thinking about all the other racial categories around, right? Just bear these in mind. And that's why, there are some people who theorize differently about what ethnicity and race mean. The reason I treat ethnicity differently is because I feel like that is a concept where there's such an emphasis on culture and practice in a way that is not necessarily about power. Now, some people may push back on me, and I invite that pushback, but to me, race is about power, and that's the most important thing to remember. Okay, so we had some thinking about implicit bias, what's going on in our brains, we're all doing it. There are things we can do to face those, to confront them, and to be aware of them as we're creating programs. And so I wanted to do a little bit of like little history moment here of how race neutral language has been used in the past, how it has shaped the lives of people in the United States, and the kinds of different impact it's had on different communities. And some of these things will be familiar to you, maybe some less so for others. Okay, so in 1935, this is like the New Deal era. This is some of the legislation that is pulling our country out of the Depression, right? And Congress enacts the Wagner Act, also known as the National Labor Relations Act, to protect the rights of employees and employers, to encourage collective bargaining, right, so unions, and to curtail certain private sector labor and management practices which can harm the general welfare of workers, businesses, and the US economy. This idea that workers need to be protected, that there's a voice, right? And there's also an eye to like efficiently getting through conflict to keep certain businesses running in the United States so that the economy keeps growing, right? And this act gets modified very quickly, right? There's really kind of an anti-union pushback very quickly. And the kind of coverage that we have today is very different than that of 1935. But what this does, the language they used in the beginning sets the tone for where, some people might say some of the strongest workers' rights were established here for certain types of people, and that for many reasons they have been eviscerated since. But from the starting point, the term employee, this is straight up out of the language. It shall not include any individual employed as an agricultural laborer or in the domestic service of any family or person at his home, or any individual employed by his parent or spouse, or any individual having the status of an independent contractor, yada, yada, yada. Okay. Why does it say this? Because at the time, the Democrats in the South, right, there hadn't been a realignment of parties yet, right? The Democrats of the South were organized white supremacists. And even though they're looking in a way to kind of expand possibilities for working white people, right, they want those programs. The South has been having a hard time since the end of slavery, right, with the economy, at least for white people, right, that's been difficult, and it never got stronger. It took some time. So, you know, Southern Democrats were interested in this, but they wanted to maintain the racial hierarchy. And so the most senior members of the committees, and many of the most senior members of Congress were white Southern Democrats. So that means that they got to like shape rules and shape legislation first, right? They got the first bit. They were the ones that everyone else had to reckon with. And so this Congressman Rankin from Mississippi, he was like the architect. And he said, we're going to make sure that these people don't get to benefit from that, right? Because the majority of people who were doing domestic service, right, were Black women in the South. The majority of people who are doing agricultural labor in the South were Black men. We also see, right, more so in the West, in part of the Midwest, Mexican and Filipino Americans or Filipinx Americans, right, are written out of this immediately. And then in a bigger way, also, right, immigrants. The thing is, the National Labor Relations Act, other than these categories covered, you didn't have to be a US citizen to have some coverage from this, right? But given where many immigrant groups end up going to the labor force, in domestic service and in agricultural labor, they are unprotected, right? And if this is the starting point, if this is where, in some regard, we have the strongest worker rights and we've only been scaled back since, these occupations have never been brought in appropriately, right? And today, it's, you know, in the South and the West, wherever, most of the people who are filling these jobs maybe aren't Black women and Black men, but they are immigrants, they are Mexicans, right? They're whoever the new group is who's coming into work, right? That's what's happening. But it's not white people, right? So you still see the design, you know, Rankin maybe patting himself on the back wherever he is today. This structure has not been confronted, has not been pulled apart, because these exceptions have never been confronted, right? Race neutral legislation, you will see nothing in this thing about race, but it did all this work, right? And so even just the way that we think about the people who are bringing us our food, these so-called, right, the essential workers of the pandemic, right? The domestic service, the childcare. Like, my life has been upended, right? Like, as a person, as a 4-year-old, like, I am very much dependent to get my work done on people who can take care of my kid, right? And depending on where my kid has been, a lot of these folks are immigrants, right? Now, in a childcare, you know, in a childcare center, right, not in my home, are they maybe still have better chances of like having, you know, being organized? Yeah, but imagine all of the people who are working in individual homes, as far as like negotiating their terms of labor, this is all between the people who are doing the hiring, right? The families and the person who's doing the work. There's nobody who's coming in between. And that leaves a lot of people really vulnerable, right? So, so that's one example, and it's with us today. We see the consequences still today. Okay, another one really big, really, really, really big. The Servicemen Readjustment Act of 1944, also known as the GI Bill, the original, right? The whole purpose here, oops, there we go. A major, major piece of legislation that was going to help veterans of World War II readjust to civilian life. Okay, this was to provide financial support in the form of cash stipends for schooling, for low interest mortgages, for job skill training, low interest loans for businesses, and unemployment benefits. The reason that this occurred in World War II is because the United States treated its veterans of World War I like crap. Like crap. And I think it weighed heavily on people's conscience, what veterans endured and came back to. The kinds of cracks they fell through was abhorrent. So here this was going to be this heroic effort to honor, you know, veterans. And in many ways, it changed the entire country, right? So not only do you have all these people coming back, right? But it changes the idea of what's even possible in the United States, so that the idea of going to school, that was a very elite thing to do, period. Usually you're gonna be white, and you're gonna be an elite white person. The GI Bill creates the possibility of not being from the upper class and going to college or getting vocational training and then setting yourself up for business or something like that. I mean, this is huge. The no money down government-backed mortgages, low interest, shape the entire way that we even think about housing today, even for those people who are not veterans, right? It changed that whole market. The idea of unemployment benefits was actually quite debated. The United States has never been really big on the idea of people getting cash in hand for doing nothing. And so there was quite a debate about this, but the idea that people could get cash, right? And they could be unemployed and they could be compensated for what it is that they did in the military, right? This changes everything. And what this does, right, is create the opportunities for upward mobility in a way that the United States had never seen prior. To go to college, to create businesses, to own a home that you can pass either down to your children or that you could take equity out of and do something else with that, changes the game. The disparate impact that we see is that this didn't write people of color out, but it made it really hard for all people of color to benefit from this, okay? So how did that happen? Well, this bill was administered through the Veterans Administration, and the Veterans Administration is carried out at the local level. The congressmen who designed this were the same group of characters who designed the New Deal. And they were going to write in because they knew they wanted the good old boys in the local level to be in charge of where the money was going. So right at the local, they could wash their hands in Congress and not have anything to do with it because they knew at the local level there was very little way that any Black people were going to be able to benefit from this. Part of the reason was that, so when it came to like apprenticeships, like there would be the idea of like who qualified for what was shaped by stereotypes, and what somebody's labor was worth, shaped by the idea of like wanting to keep hierarchical order. You don't want, this idea of like Black people making the same thing as whites, like no way. There are a lot of HBCUs in the South, right? And yet not enough to accommodate all the veterans right? They couldn't accommodate everybody. They didn't have all of the courses available. They didn't have all the equipment available. They didn't have all the domiciles available so that people could actually live in town and go to college, right? There were all these things that they didn't have, disproportionately speaking, because Black veterans couldn't go to the white schools, right? So it always had to be like a Black institution, or to like get a home, like there was the whole redlining thing. So to even be qualified to buy in a certain neighborhood, like, no. And we see the same thing happening in the North. This is not a, this is not a Southern issue. How few, let's see, what do I have? I have a couple little pieces of information here. The GI Bill included support for banks to provide veterans low-cost, zero down payment house. But for the first 67,000 mortgages that were secured by the GI Bill for the returning veterans in New York and Northern Virginia alone, fewer than 100 were taken out by non-whites. The GI Bill helped place 6,500 former soldiers in Mississippi on non-farm jobs by fall of 1947. But while 86% of the skilled and semi-skilled jobs were filled by whites, 92% of the unskilled ones were filled by Blacks. There's this recreation not only of like the plantation and the sharecropping system, right? It's happening over and over, this idea of what skilled and unskilled is looking like. This was also the case in the West. And so, people who were Mexican American veterans, they also encountered this. Now, this is not to say that there weren't Black people who benefited from this. There were. There were also Mexican veterans who benefited from this bill, but disproportionately. That's the injustice, right? It's the disproportionate amount that it was not available in the same way it was available to white people. And so we see these skewed opportunities that created disparities of intergenerational wealth and upward mobility for decades forward. Okay, so this is a big one. More recently, there were several pieces of legislation passed in the 80s and 90s in relation to drug and the drug war. This particular act is really important because it created mandatory minimum sentences. It takes away the discretion of judges to make any decision of like, well, I see what this person's background was. It seemed like, this is the first time he's been in here. Maybe this was just, he got caught up in the wrong crowd. Like that whole story gets thrown out the window. It doesn't matter what that individual story is. They immediately are handed a sentence for the possession of cocaine, right? But different types of sentences for different amounts of cocaine and different types, all right? So 5 years in prison was given to those who were in possession of 5 grams of crack cocaine. And that same amount of time was given to those possessing 500 grams of powder cocaine. So what you get is a 100-to-1 disparity ratio, which has only now been changed in 2010 to an 18-to-1. So the disparity still exists. This has not been eradicated yet. The reason why this is race neutral but has disparate impact is because the idea of crack cocaine was, at the time of this construction of this legislation, was framed as being more dangerous and more addictive. And that the idea that it was also less expensive, and it was being distributed and being used, this idea was being distributed and used by Blacks more often. Whereas powder cocaine was more expensive, it was not thought to be as addictive or as dangerous. And so not even just about the idea of who's using it, but around the kinds of like violence and business that's happening around the distribution of these drugs, right? So, so the drugs itself are racialized because of how they are conceived, right? This conflation of danger, addictiveness, depravity with crack gets smashed on top of Blackness, right? The cocaine crack epidemic, in every media, you know, I remember growing up watching the TV, people talking about the crack epidemic, and it was always a picture of Black people, always a picture of Black people. And the powder cocaine, you know, the people sniffing in the bathroom, you know, the white guy with the Ferrari type of thing, right? It was being racialized in our media, and given the way that Black communities are over policed and the way that Black people are racially profiled anyway by the police, the human life that was taken and put into prisons because of this act, we are still dealing with this. There are people who are still serving time, right, because of this, and disproportionately so because of concepts of what was dangerous and who was using it. But never in this legislation do you see anything about Black or white, right? It's the way in which we have racialized a thing, right? Or the way that we have thought about crime. And so I think that this is really important. It's a more recent example. I'm trying to think, where are we now? We're 5 minutes. So these are some examples, right, of race neutral and dangerous legislation. But then there are also, and I put in the question that we can discuss in the breakout rooms, is that there's also been, you know, efforts to counter these, and that these efforts also shape our lives. So for example, affirmative action, not a perfect policy, but one that has been used in many ways to counter structural racism. It's not perfect. It's definitely not enough. I have benefited from that my entire life as a woman and as a Mexican American. And when we talk about affirmative action, we also need to talk about all the ways that white women have benefited from affirmative action, and that they are the primary beneficiary of affirmative action. So even if we don't necessarily think about our day-to-day lives being shaped by these policies, in fact, they are, right? Or I never got to ask my grandfather, my Mexican grandfather, whether or not, he's passed now, whether or not he was able to use the GI Bill for the house that they purchased in 1947, 48, that he lived in with my grandmother until the day they died, right? But what a house did for the family was some kind of stability, even though upward mobility was a slow lurch forward, and it was really happened for like the next generation. It was something stable, but that wasn't the case for everybody. So a lot to think about here, and I'm looking forward to both Q&A, and I'm looking forward to seeing how these breakout groups work and how people operate here. And again, thank you for letting me be part of this today.
Thank you so much, Tehama. So we're relaxing the guideline on the chat. So if you have a question, we have about 10 minutes we're going to take for Q&A. You may put it in the chat, or I'm going to, let me switch to gallery view. I can't quite see everybody, but if you would rather raise your hand and ask the question out loud, that's fine. Just wave your hand until I see you, and that can work as well. So yeah, I would love if anybody has a question.
Leanne, could she unshare her screen?
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah,
sure.
that will help. Thank you.
Let me figure that out. Okay, stop sharing. Okay, is that good?
Yeah, that's great.
Okay, thanks. Thank you.
Okay. Did I see somebody waving their hand? You can unmute and also say something so that I know you're waving your hand. Okay. Oh, okay. Oh, here's a question. Okay. Affirmative action designed to benefit white women? Question mark. Please expound.
Yeah. So the idea that that on the basis of sex, right, that those people who are underrepresented have been historically, discriminated against, that covered women, that covered white women. So white women were allowed to benefit, and they actually ended up being the greatest beneficiaries, period. So we see all these white women in work. Affirmative action is there. That's happening. So next time you look at an application, that's what's going on. I mean, affirmative action in its original design, like, if you look at Lyndon Johnson making a graduation speech to Howard University graduates and talking about what the vision is, that you don't, I have the quote in the book, but this idea of like literally chaining people and, right. And then asking them to run a race and be at the same, step. He's like, no, you have to take affirmative action. Right. And we see Nixon supporting affirmative action strongly for a good part of his administration. Like, he's an advocate. The Supreme Court backing it to the point where it didn't matter that there was, it didn't matter whether there was intent to discriminate, as long as the outcome was different, as long as there was disproportional outcome. The Supreme Court was like, well, that's what we're looking for, is the outcome. But then you get to Bakke and you see Davis case, and they start peeling back. And you also see that the matter of intent becomes more and more important for Supreme Court doctrine overall, not just with the discrimination with in regards to jobs, but in the way that policing occurs, right? That as long as race is not the only factor in which a police officer pulls over somebody in their car, it can still be one of the factors. That's constitutional. So, I mean,
shaking my head on that one.
Yeah, no, it's crazy.
Yeah, and the person who asked the question commented, that is never talked about. That is how affirmative action has been designed and benefits white women. Mm-hmm. So I'm not seeing, y'all don't have any questions? Okay, I'm gonna follow up on that affirmative action piece, and then yeah, we'll see. So one of the things that I see also happening around the pushback around affirmative action mm-hmm. is that it has created a whole nother set of ways in which people who might be benefiting from it then end up getting discriminated against, because of the assumption that people have, with the wrong understanding, I believe, of affirmative action, that they are not capable. Mm-hmm. And I saw this when I went to college. I went to college the fall after the Bakke decision was announced, and they had pointed at my college as having a good kind of affirmative action plan. And so those of us who are African American and other racialized minorities in the school, in the predominantly white institution, were under a cloud. We were seen as being less capable. Mm-hmm. And here now in 2016, a 2016 graduate I know of that same institution found that the exact same kind of cloud was still there for them, which I don't think is an argument against affirmative action, but it's, I think it is it points to the persistence of biases and discrimination, even in the face of systemic solutions. Mm-hmm. So mm-hmm. I don't know, that's not really a question, but it's sort of a comment. And look, now I'm getting some
yeah, well put.
Here.
Yeah. This is why it's so, the way that people reframe and push back is so important, because like, I looked so hard in my office for this book called When Affirmative Action Was White by Ira Katznelson, which I think I put on the list. Mm-hmm. And I mean, right, he goes through the legislation that I was just talking about, right? Like, that's what it was. When there's the disproportion of the extra push, right? The wind at the back. Not to say, right, that like that it helped white people so much disproportionately. And affirmative action today for racialized minorities, right, the way you're talking about, like, we've had quotas for decades. That has been unconstitutional for decades. That's another thing. I still have undergraduate students who think that quotas exist, right? No, not in their whole lifetime, actually, has it existed. The idea that when you have all of these fabulous applicants for college, for example, right, that everyone's meeting some threshold of like good candidate. Now you have to choose, well, they can't all come, right? And affirmative action is some people use the point system, right? It's that one other thing that they're going to add to that person's application that has already met the threshold of being, this is a damn good candidate, right? And we use all these other things, and those points too. Do you play the violin?
Mm-hmm.
Are you from New Hampshire? Right? Are your parents filthy rich? Whatever, right? So that's also affirmative action. Yeah. Absolutely.
Okay.
And the reason, and the good pushback against it from like somebody like Michelle Alexander, who writes The New Jim Crow, is to say that affirmative action, her argument is that affirmative action has been kind of a way of distracting the civil rights activists, people, to kind of acquiesce, to say, well, at least this is a win for some Black people, mainly middle class people who were more likely to be upwardly mobile to begin with. And that's why she advocates for an all of us or none of us type of situation. Okay.
Yeah. So I've got a couple more comments in the chat. I don't know, can you see the chat? Do you want me to read them to you?
Not yet, no.
Okay, no, don't worry about it then.
Okay.
One person, I think is a comment, I'm not sure if there's a question in here, references Kimberly Crenshaw's work on intersectionality. It says, unless you look at the many ways that someone's identity shows up, in their case, both Black and female, you have a situation where all Blacks are women, all the Blacks are men and all the women are white.
Right.
So, looking at President Obama's initiative for Black men and boys, and the discussion even recently around police violence, it's centering Black men as if Black women are not also, Breonna Taylor, I interjected that, the victims of police violence or deserving of attention from White House initiatives. And noting for affirmative action legacies in football players. Right. So I don't know if you want to respond to that. There's also another question.
We treat that in our book, Intersectionality. I could read a little bit from it. It's a theory that highlights the heterogeneity of privileges and layers of oppression that individuals within a group may experience. It's a paradigm rooted in the analysis of Black women's experiences that reveals that Black women are doubly bound due to overlapping layers of oppression, including racism and sexism. This paradigm asserts that race constructs the way that women experience gender, and gender influences how women experience race. And that's actually, I think it's a lot to wrap a person's head around. I still sit and I think about the ways in which that happens. And intersectionality has sometimes been, first of all, taken out of its rootedness in the Black woman's experience and applied all place. And the idea also that people have been thinking about it as in like terms of identities that aren't particularly salient even, or in ways that it helps people think about diversity. Like my intersectional experience as a dog walker and a woman, like being a dog walker, like, unless we're in a special context in which dog walking is particularly salient and consequential, this is not where we need to be discussing intersectionality. Yeah. And so I'm glad whoever this was brought it up. It absolutely shapes the way that we need to think about also implicit biases, right? Yeah.
Okay, so then there's another one. If there's time and we have like a minute, can you address some of the ways that wealth and or education interact with classifications of race in America?
Yeah, in a minute. So it's still, so given especially there's the intergenerational matter that has made it difficult for upward mobility for people who are not white, right? But there are still white people who are not upwardly mobile, that, you know, they're class subjugated. And what it's certainly, I'm trying to connect it to other things I've said. As far as implicit bias, I think that it has led us to flatten people's experiences. It has led us to speak in simple terms about what privilege is. So when people talk about white privilege, I really encourage people to compare people who are more similarly situated. So white privilege makes the most sense to talk about when we're talking about, if you want to talk about women who are making $60,000 a year with health insurance, right? So white women who are making $60,000 with health insurance, and Black women who are making $60,000 a year in health insurance. Now, what are their health outcomes? How are they being treated when they go to the doctor's office? Who is advocating for them to get surgery that they need, the treatment that they need? And when white people get treated better at the hospital, when their lives are seen as more important, that's the privilege part, right? Even though they might be similarly situated class-wise. There's a whole lot more to say about that I can't really do it justice right now.
Okay.
With that time.
Yeah. Well, we don't have all night, and we really appreciate your joining us for this presentation. So
Thank you.
everybody can silently clap. do the ASL.
Thank you. This is really warm.
clap.
I'm feeling it.
Yeah, good.
So
thank you so much for joining us. And Tehama, for those of you all who are in the community working group, you'll have Tehama with you in that group. So we're going to now go to our working groups. We'll be there until approximately 8:55, and so I'm gonna hit the button, and hopefully everybody should get their invitation to working groups. We have our discussion questions, and our facilitators, I think, are all set. So here we go. So thanks again, and we'll see you later.
thank you, everybody. Be well.
Okay. Oh, Devanshi may be driving and not see her group. So I'm going to go ahead and make you the host. So there you go. And hop into my working group. Oh, you might need to assign me. Yeah, I couldn't do both things. So you'll see the breakout group doodah there. Do you see the?
I see
okay.
I see unassigned, and
So
then
you see me as unassigned?
I see legal working group and community working
yes,
group.
Legal working group.
Okay, so that's where I'm going. So I'm sending you.
Yep. See ya.
Legal. Bye. Have fun.
Okay. Thanks. Bye.
Bye. Well. Not low key, baby, high key, but it's straight because like right now they're all in their little breakout rooms. I'm just playing security guard, really. Like I'm just here to make sure that no one hacks into the Zoom because they've had history and they're having like the legal conversations tonight. So like they wanted to be extra trouble. But you know what I'm gonna do since I'm just sitting here watching this camera? I'm gonna just shake this little makeshift grinder and grind up my pen because that's all I got. Ginger ale. My favorite. Well then shit, you might as well text me then. I'll be texting you, carry my ass. I don't hit you on Snap just for gas. I hit you on Snap because I'm your friend. Yes. Oh, let me join you. still deleted it. Hey, I ain't gonna front with you, Kwame. Like, my money, I don't know if I can afford it, but I'm just volunteering as being like your sample. Like, I will sample everything and anything you want me to sample, no matter how big or how small the sample is. You know what I'm saying? Like, Kwame, like, please use me as your weed connoisseur. Well, I told her. Yeah. Y'all really out here dating white men wholeheartedly. Oh my God, has been recording the whole time. That's embarrassing. Well, Leanne, when you watch this part, just ixnay on this. Oh, but is it recording? Is it recording this whole interaction?
Do that.
Oh, I'm okay. Then I can give it back to you.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Also, are you
Oh,
getting?
maybe I've got it back. Okay.
You got it?
Nope.
No?
I don't think I do.
Can one of you turn off the recording?
Oh, didn't I do that? Oh no.
It's still recording.
I